I never thought my own son would look me in the eye and agree to cast me aside like yesterday's newspaper. But there I was, sitting at their elegant dining table, fork halfway to my mouth with the expensive salmon Stephanie had prepared, when she decided to deliver what she probably thought was some kind of gift to the family. "Eleanor, we've been talking," she began, her voice sickeningly sweet, the way it always got when she was about to say something particularly cruel. She set down her wine glass with deliberate precision, the crystal making a soft clink against the mahogany table. "This year we want a peaceful Thanksgiving without all the drama." I set my fork down carefully, my hands steadier than I felt inside. The dining room suddenly felt smaller, the walls closing in as I processed her words. "Drama? You know what I mean." Stephanie's smile was razor sharp. "Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see how far our stories are reaching." Her perfectly veneered teeth gleaming in the chandelier light. "The way you always have opinions about everything. How we raise the kids, how we spend our money, how we decorate the house, how we live our lives. It's exhausting, honestly." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was about to consume everything in its path. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, but I kept my expression neutral. 26 years of practice had taught me how to hide my feelings from this woman. I looked at Robert, my only child, the boy I'd raised alone after his father died when he was 12. He was studying his plate like it held the secrets of the universe, his jaw tight, that little muscle twitching the way it always did when he was uncomfortable. The same tell he'd had since he was a toddler, trying to avoid getting in trouble. "Say something," I thought desperately. "Tell her she's wrong. Tell her I'm your mother. Tell her that without me, you wouldn't have this house, this life, this comfortable existence you take for granted." But he didn't. "Mom," he finally said, still not meeting my eyes, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe it would be better if you spent the holidays somewhere else this year. Give everyone some space to breathe." The words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. I felt my ribcage tighten, that familiar ache spreading through my entire torso, making it hard to draw a full breath. But I'd learned long ago not to show weakness in front of Stephanie. She fed on it like a vampire feeds on blood, storing it up to use against me later. "I see." I kept my voice level, even managed a small smile that felt like it might crack my face in half. "Well, I certainly don't want to cause any problems for anyone." Stephanie's eyes gleamed with satisfaction, that predatory look she got whenever she managed to wound me successfully. She'd won this round, and she knew it. "I'm so glad you understand, Eleanor. Some mothers would make this difficult, throw tantrums, cause scenes, but you've always been so reasonable about these things." Reasonable. That's what they called it when you swallowed your pride and accepted being treated like garbage by the people who were supposed to love you most in this world. Reasonable was code for weak, for pushover, for the kind of woman who would quietly disappear when asked. "Of course," I said, dabbing my mouth with the linen napkin, the same expensive set I'd given them for their 10th wedding anniversary. "Family harmony is what matters most." My 8-year-old grandson Tommy looked up from his plate, his innocent blue eyes darting between the adults with confusion. He could sense the tension even if he couldn't understand it, the way children always can. "Is Grandma Eleanor leaving already? But we haven't had dessert yet." "Grandma has some important things to take care of, sweetheart," Stephanie said smoothly, reaching over to ruffle his hair with false affection. "Adult things that can't wait." I stood up slowly, feeling every one of my 58 years in my bones. I gathered my purse from the sideboard, the same sideboard I'd helped them pick out when they first moved into this house, and kissed the top of Tommy's head. His hair smelled like the expensive shampoo Stephanie bought. Nothing like the Johnson's baby shampoo Robert's hair used to smell like when he was little. "I'll see you soon, sweetheart," I told him, hoping it wasn't a lie. "Where are you going, Grandma Eleanor?" he asked, his little voice cutting through my heart like a serrated knife. "I have some things to organize," I told him, and it wasn't a lie. I really did have some very important things to take care of. Stephanie walked me to the door, practically glowing with triumph. Her heels clicked against the hardwood floors I'd helped refinish 3 summers ago, when they couldn't afford to hire professionals. "I hope you know this isn't personal, Eleanor. It's just what's best for everyone involved." I paused at the threshold, looking back at the house I'd helped them buy, at the life I'd helped them build with my late husband's life insurance money, the same money they thought they were inheriting someday. "Oh, I know exactly what this is about," Stephanie. Something in my tone made her frown slightly, a tiny crack in her victorious facade, but I was already walking to my car. As I drove away, I caught a glimpse of Robert in the rearview mirror, standing in the doorway watching me leave. For just a moment, he looked like the little boy who used to run to me crying when he'd scraped his knee or had a nightmare. But then Stephanie appeared beside him, slipping her arm around his waist possessively, and he stepped back inside. I made it exactly 3 blocks before I had to pull over. My hands were shaking too badly to drive safely. I sat there in my car, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, feeling like I'd just been kicked in the stomach by my own child. 26 years. That's how long I'd been part of Robert's marriage, watching Stephanie slowly but systematically push me to the edges of his life, like she was erasing me with a careful, methodical hand. It started small, suggesting I call before coming over instead of just stopping by like I always had. Then it was comments about how I was spoiling the grandchildren with too many gifts or too much attention. Then passive-aggressive remarks about how some mothers couldn't let go and let their children live their own lives. And Robert? He just let it happen, every single time. I thought about all the times I'd bitten my tongue when Stephanie made her little digs, each one designed to draw blood without leaving visible marks. All the times I'd pretended not to notice when she forgot to invite me to birthday parties or school events that I used to be included in automatically. All the times I'd smiled and nodded when she criticized my gifts as too expensive or inappropriate or not what we would have chosen. But this was different. This wasn't just exclusion. This was banishment. This was my own son telling me I wasn't welcome at family gatherings anymore. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for. Margaret Fleming, my financial advisor. We'd been working together for 15 years. Ever since Richard's life insurance money came through and I'd suddenly found myself responsible for a sum of money I'd never imagined having. Margaret? It's Eleanor Walsh. I need to schedule a meeting. Tomorrow, if possible. Of course, Eleanor. Is everything all right? You sound upset. I stared at Robert's house in my rearview mirror, watching Stephanie close the curtains in the front window like she was shutting out the world, or shutting me out specifically. Let's just say it's time to make some significant changes to my accounts and investments. There was a pause on the other end. Margaret had been handling my finances long enough to know that I didn't make impulsive decisions. I see. Would 10 a.m. work for you? Perfect. And Margaret, bring all the documentation for the Thompson Industries investments. The ones that are technically in Robert's name but funded entirely by my portfolio. Another pause. Longer this time. I could practically hear the wheels turning in her head. All of them? Every single one. And the real estate investments too, the ones for the rental properties they think they own. After I hung up, I sat there for a few more minutes, feeling something cold and sharp settling in my chest where my heart used to be. Stephanie thought she'd won the war she'd been waging against me for over 2 decades. She thought she'd finally gotten rid of the interfering mother-in-law once and for all. She had absolutely no idea what she'd just set in motion. I started the car and drove home to my empty house, already making mental lists of everything that needed to be done. There were phone calls to make, papers to review, legal documents to examine, and decisions that couldn't be undone once they were made. Stephanie wanted a peaceful Thanksgiving without me in the picture. She was about to get exactly what she asked for, and so much more than she bargained for. The next morning, I sat in my kitchen staring at the stack of financial documents spread across my breakfast table, each page representing years of careful planning and generous giving that my son and daughter-in-law had taken completely for granted. The coffee had gone cold in my cup hours ago, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I was too busy remembering how we'd gotten to this point. It hadn't always been this way. When Robert first brought Stephanie home 28 years ago, I'd been thrilled. She was beautiful, charming, and seemed to genuinely care about my son. I remember thinking how lucky Robert was to find someone who lit up when he walked into a room. What I didn't realize then was that Stephanie's light had a way of dimming everyone else's until she was the only star in the sky. The changes started so gradually that I didn't notice them at first. Small things, really. Stephanie would suggest that maybe I should call before stopping by, just to make sure we're home. It seemed reasonable enough. Then she started mentioning how overwhelmed Robert was with work, And wouldn't it be better if I visited less often so he could have time to decompress? I told myself she was just being protective of her husband. That's what wives do, right? But then came the bigger manipulations, the ones that should have been red flags if I hadn't been so desperate to maintain peace in the family. Like the time Stephanie convinced Robert that I was being too controlling by offering to help with their mortgage payments when he'd lost his job. She sat in my living room with tears in her eyes, explaining how humiliated Robert felt accepting money from his mother, how it made him feel like less of a man. "He's too proud to say anything," she'd whispered, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "But I can see how much it's hurting his self-esteem. Maybe if you just backed off a little, let him figure things out on his own?" So I'd backed off. I'd watched my son struggle with unemployment for 6 months, stress eating and drinking too much, while Stephanie played the long-suffering wife who never complained about their mounting bills. And when Robert finally swallowed his pride and asked for help, she made sure I knew it was a loan that they fully intended to pay back. They never did, of course, but by then Stephanie had trained me not to mention it. The real masterpiece of her manipulation came when they decided to start a family. Suddenly, I wasn't just the interfering mother-in-law anymore. I was the potentially dangerous grandmother who might spoil the children or undermine their parenting decisions. Every gift I brought was too expensive, teaching the kids to be materialistic. Every suggestion I made was outdated because parenting had changed so much since I'd raised Robert. "Eleanor, I hope you don't mind me saying this," Stephanie had said when Tommy was just 2 years old. "But Robert and I have decided we want to raise him with clear boundaries about gifts and treats. We don't want him to expect presents every time someone visits." I'd been bringing Tommy a small toy train, nothing extravagant. Just a little wooden engine that cost maybe $15. But the way Stephanie looked at it, you'd have thought I'd bought him a pony. "Of course," I'd said, tucking the train back into my purse. "I understand completely. What I understood was that I was being trained like a dog, conditioned to ask permission before showing love to my own grandchild. But the cruelest manipulation of all was how Stephanie used Robert's guilt about his father's death. Richard had died so suddenly, a massive heart attack at 53, leaving Robert feeling like he'd never had enough time to prove himself as a man. Stephanie exploited that wound masterfully, constantly reinforcing the idea that Robert needed to be independent, that accepting help from his mother was somehow a betrayal of his father's memory. Richard would want Robert to stand on his own 2 feet, she'd say whenever I offered assistance. He wouldn't want his son to be dependent on anyone, even family. She made my generosity sound like weakness, my love sound like control, and Robert, still grieving his father all these years later, believed every word. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the photos from Tommy's birthday party last month. There I was in the background of every shot, smiling dutifully while Stephanie orchestrated the perfect celebration. I'd paid for the bounce house rental, the catering, even the expensive cake from that boutique bakery Stephanie insisted was the only place in town that made real birthday cakes. But in every photo, I looked like a guest in my own grandson's life. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In one picture, Stephanie was whispering something to her sister-in-law, Robert's cousin's wife, while pointing in my direction. Both women were laughing. I zoomed in on their faces, seeing the kind of mean-spirited amusement that women get when they're sharing particularly juicy gossip. I set the phone down and reached for the letter that had arrived yesterday, the one that had been sitting unopened on my counter because I'd been too emotionally drained to deal with another piece of mail. It was from my attorney's office, just routine correspondence about updating my will, but it reminded me of something I'd almost forgotten. 3 years ago, when Robert and Stephanie were struggling with their business venture, some consulting firm that never quite got off the ground, I'd quietly arranged for them to be listed as beneficiaries on several of my investment accounts. Not my entire estate, but enough to give them a comfortable future. At the time, I told myself it was smart planning, a way to help them without making them feel like charity cases. Now I realized it was just another way Stephanie had maneuvered me into financing their lives while making me feel grateful for the privilege. I thought about the conversation I'd overheard 6 months ago when I'd arrived early for Sunday dinner. I'd let myself in through the back door, as I always did, and heard Stephanie talking on the phone in the kitchen. Trust me, she's not going anywhere, Stephanie had been saying, her voice carrying that satisfied tone she got when she'd successfully manipulated a situation. Eleanor might throw her little tantrums about feeling unappreciated, but she's too attached to Tommy to actually stay away for long. And honestly, when she's gone, we'll inherit everything anyway. Robert's her only child. She'd laughed then, a sound that had made my skin crawl. I just have to make sure she doesn't get any crazy ideas about changing her will out of spite. But don't worry, I've got her completely under control. She does exactly what I want her to do, when I want her to do it. I'd stood there in the mudroom, grocery bags full of ingredients for the dinner I'd volunteered to cook, listening to my daughter-in-law discuss my death like it was a business transaction she was looking forward to closing. That night, I'd gone home and stared at myself in the bathroom mirror for a long time, trying to recognize the woman looking back at me. When had I become so pathetic? When had I allowed someone else to decide how much love I was allowed to show my own family? The phone rang, startling me out of my memories. Margaret Fleming's name appeared on the caller ID. Eleanor. I've been thinking about our meeting today, she said without preamble. Before we make any major changes, I want to make sure you understand the full scope of what we're talking about. I understand perfectly, I said, gathering the documents into a neat pile. How much are we talking about, Margaret? Total value of everything that's currently set up to benefit Robert and Stephanie. There was a pause while she consulted her files. Including the investment accounts, the real estate holdings, and the trust fund for Tommy's education, we're looking at approximately $2.8 million. $2.8 million. Money that Stephanie was counting on inheriting. Money she'd already spent in her mind. Money that gave her the confidence to treat me like hired help in my own son's life. And if I were to make changes to these arrangements, I asked, how quickly could they take effect? Immediately, in most cases. The investment accounts can be restructured today if that's what you want. The real estate would take a bit longer, but we could start the process within the week. I thought about Stephanie's smug smile yesterday, the way she'd savored every moment of my humiliation. I thought about Robert's silence, his complete failure to defend the woman who'd raised him alone and sacrificed everything to give him a good life. Most of all, I thought about Tommy, my precious grandson who would grow up thinking it was normal to treat people who love you like they're disposable. Margaret, I said, I'll see you at 10. I'll see. And bring the paperwork to establish a new charitable foundation. I've decided it's time to do something meaningful with Richard's life insurance money. After I hung up, I sat in the quiet of my kitchen, feeling something shift inside my chest. For the first time in years, I wasn't planning my day around what Robert and Stephanie might need or want from me. I was planning around what I needed and wanted for myself. The woman who had swallowed insults and accepted scraps of affection was gone. The woman who was about to walk into that lawyer's office had finally remembered who she used to be before Stephanie started telling her who she was allowed to be. And Stephanie had absolutely no idea what was coming. Margaret Fleming's office always smelled like leather and confidence, the kind of place where serious money was discussed in hushed tones. I sat across from her mahogany desk, watching her flip through file after file, each one representing a piece of the financial empire I'd built in secret over the past 15 years. Eleanor, I have to ask, Margaret said, removing her reading glasses and fixing me with the look she reserved for clients who were about to make decisions they might regret. Are you absolutely certain about this? Once we restructure these accounts, there's no going back without significant legal complications. I thought about yesterday's lunch, about Stephanie's satisfied smirk when she dismissed me from their lives. I've never been more certain of anything in my life. She nodded slowly and opened the thickest file. Let's start with the Thompson Industries portfolio. You've been funding these investments for 7 years now, all channeled through Robert's name for tax purposes. Current value is $1.2 million. $1.2 million that my son thought he'd earned through his own business acumen. The irony would have been funny if it wasn't so pathetic. What does Robert think these investments are? I asked, even though I already knew the answer. According to our records, he believes they're returns on an initial investment he made using a small inheritance from his father. $50,000 that he thinks grew into this portfolio through careful trading and market timing. I almost laughed. Robert had never been good with money, even as a child. He'd spend his allowance on the first thing that caught his eye and then wonder why he couldn't afford the toy he really wanted by the end of the week. The idea that he'd turned $50,000 into over $1 million through savvy investing was absurd, but it fed his ego to believe it. And the rental properties? Margaret pulled out another file. 3 properties in downtown, all purchased in Robert's name but with mortgages and down payments funded entirely through your accounts. Combined equity value of approximately $800,000. The rental income has been going directly to Robert and Stephanie for the past 5 years. I remember when I'd suggested buying those properties, Stephanie had been complaining about money again, making pointed comments about how expensive everything was getting, how hard it was to maintain their lifestyle on Robert's income alone. I'd presented the rental property idea as a way for them to create passive income, never mentioning that I'd be the one actually buying the buildings. They think the properties were purchased with a business loan? Margaret continued. A loan that you co-signed, but that they believe they're primarily responsible for paying back. The rental income was nearly $4,000 a month. For 5 years, they'd been collecting that money, thinking they were successful real estate investors. Stephanie had even bragged to her friends about their property empire, as if she and Robert were self-made moguls. What about Tommy's education fund? Fully funded college account, $300,000. Enough to cover 4 years at any university in the country, plus graduate school if he chooses. Currently set up as a trust with Robert and Stephanie as trustees. I'd started that fund when Tommy was born, adding money every month like other grandparents might add to a piggy bank. I'd imagined him opening the acceptance letter to his dream school, never having to worry about student loans or choosing a cheaper option because of money. And finally, Margaret said, opening the last file, your primary estate, current value $2.1 million, with Robert as the sole beneficiary. The total was staggering. Even to me, over $4.2 million that my son and daughter-in-law had no idea they were depending on. Money that Stephanie was counting on to fund her comfortable retirement. Money that made her feel secure enough to treat me like an inconvenience. Margaret, I want you to understand something, I said, leaning forward in my chair. This isn't about revenge. This is about teaching them the value of what they've taken for granted. She raised an eyebrow. What exactly are you proposing? I want to restructure everything. The Thompson Industries investments, liquidate them, and transfer the funds to a new account in my name only. The rental properties, I want them sold, with proceeds going into the same account. The education fund stays as is, but I want myself listed as the sole trustee. Margaret was writing quickly, but I could see the concern in her eyes. And your primary estate? I want to establish a charitable foundation. The Eleanor and Richard Walsh Foundation for Single Mothers Pursuing Higher Education. Everything goes there when I die, except for a small trust fund for Tommy that he can access when he turns 30. The silence in the office was deafening. Margaret set down her pen and stared at me for a long moment. Eleanor, you realize what this means? Robert and Stephanie will lose almost all of their current income streams. The rental properties alone provide them with nearly $50,000 a year. The investment returns they've been counting on. Gone. Their entire financial plan is based on assets they don't actually own. I know exactly what it means. They'll have to sell their house. Robert's consulting business doesn't generate enough income to maintain their current lifestyle. Stephanie will have to get a job for the first time in 15 years. The thought of Stephanie, who'd never worked a day since Tommy was born, having to find employment was almost too delicious to contemplate. She'd spent years telling me how blessed she was to be able to stay home with Tommy, as if her lifestyle was some kind of divine gift rather than the result of my financial support. What will you tell them? Margaret asked. Nothing, initially. I want to see how long it takes them to notice. Robert receives statements for the investment accounts quarterly. The next batch goes out in 6 weeks. The rental income gets deposited on the 1st of every month. They'll realize something's wrong by December. Margaret shook her head. This is going to devastate them. Good. Maybe devastation will teach them something that comfort never could. I thought about all the times I'd watched Stephanie dismiss other people's struggles, the way she'd roll her eyes when her friends complained about money problems. Some people just don't know how to manage their finances, she'd say. completely oblivious to the fact that her own financial security was built on someone else's generosity. "There's one more thing," I said. "I want you to prepare a detailed accounting of every dollar I've contributed to their lives over the past 15 years. Not for legal purposes, just for my own records. I want to see the total." Margaret pulled out a calculator and started entering numbers from various files. The clicking of keys filled the silence as she worked through years of contributions. Mortgage help, car payments, vacation funds, home improvements, medical bills, business investments, and countless other expenses I'd covered without ever asking for acknowledgement. "The total comes to just over $1.8 million, she said finally. "That's direct contributions, not including the ongoing investment management or rental income. $1.8 million. Nearly $2 million that I'd given them over the years, thinking I was helping my family build a secure future. Money that had bought me nothing but condescension and ultimately banishment from their lives." "How soon can we implement these changes?" I asked. "I can start the paperwork today. Most of it will be complete by the end of the week." I stood up and shook her hand. "Then let's begin." As I walked to my car, I felt lighter than I had in years. For the first time since Richard died, I was making decisions based on what I wanted, not what other people expected from me. My phone buzzed with a text message from Stephanie. "Hope you're not too upset about yesterday. Sometimes families need space to grow. Maybe we can have coffee next week and talk about boundaries going forward." Boundaries. She wanted to talk about boundaries. I deleted the message without responding. By next week, Stephanie would have much bigger things to worry about than coffee dates and boundaries. She was about to learn that the ATM she'd been using for the past 15 years had just permanently closed its account. 3 weeks had passed since my meeting with Margaret, and I spent those days in a strange state of calm that I hadn't felt in years. Every morning, I woke up without the familiar knot of anxiety in my stomach, the one that came from wondering what mood Stephanie would be in or whether Robert would remember to call. For the first time in decades, I was living for myself. I'd started taking a watercolor painting class at the community center, something I'd always wanted to try but never had time for when my schedule revolved around their needs. The instructor, a gentle woman named Patricia, who was about my age, had complimented my natural eye for color. We'd even made plans to visit the art museum together next weekend. "You seem different lately," Patricia had said yesterday as we cleaned our brushes. "More relaxed, like you've let go of something heavy, if only she knew." My phone had been blissfully quiet. No calls from Robert asking me to babysit at the last minute. No texts from Stephanie with passive-aggressive updates about family events I was no longer invited to. The silence that would have terrified me a month ago now felt like freedom, but I knew it wouldn't last. The first rental payment should have hit their account 3 days ago, and it hadn't. The quarterly investment statements were due any day now. Soon, very soon, they would realize that their comfortable world was built on quicksand. I was in my kitchen making dinner when my phone finally rang. Robert's name appeared on the screen, and I let it ring 3 times before answering. Not because I was playing games, but because I was genuinely debating whether I wanted to deal with this conversation tonight. "Hi, Robert. Mom, we need to talk." His voice was tight with stress, the same tone he'd used as a teenager when he'd crashed the car or failed a test he'd promised to study for. "What's wrong?" "Can you come over? There's something we need to discuss, and it's better if we do it in person." I almost laughed. 3 weeks ago, they'd told me I wasn't welcome in their home. Now suddenly they needed me to come over for an urgent conversation. The timing wasn't a coincidence. "Is everything all right? Just, can you come over? Please?" The please was what convinced me. Robert had inherited his father's pride, and please didn't come easily to him. Whatever was happening, it was serious enough to crack his ego. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. I took my time getting ready, choosing a navy blue dress that made me feel confident and capable. I even put on the pearl earrings Richard had given me for our 10th anniversary, the ones I'd stopped wearing because Stephanie had once commented that they were a bit much for every day. The drive to their house felt different this time. Instead of the familiar dread that usually accompanied these visits, I felt curious, almost entertained. I was about to watch the first act of a play I'd written, directed, and produced. Robert answered the door before I could knock, his face pale and drawn. "Thanks for coming, Mom." The house felt different too. The usual perfect tidiness was still there, but there was an undercurrent of tension that even Tommy seemed to sense. He gave me a quick hug before disappearing upstairs, probably sent away so the adults could talk. Stephanie was sitting at the kitchen table with papers spread in front of her, her face pinched with the kind of stress that no amount of expensive skincare could hide. She looked up when I entered, and for the first time in 26 years, I saw something I'd never seen before. Uncertainty. "Eleanor, thank you for coming." Her voice was strained, missing its usual condescending sweetness. I sat down across from them, folding my hands in my lap. "What's this about?" Robert cleared his throat and picked up one of the papers. "We've been having some problems with our accounts. Financial irregularities. The rental income didn't come through this month, and when I called the property management company, they said there had been some kind of ownership transfer." "That sounds concerning." "And our investment portfolio," Stephanie added, her voice rising slightly. "The quarterly statements came today, and they're showing zero balance across all accounts. Zero, Eleanor. Robert's entire investment history just gone." I kept my expression neutral, even as a small thrill of satisfaction ran through me. "Have you called the investment company?" "That's the weird part," Robert said, running his hands through his hair. "They're saying the accounts were liquidated by the primary account holder. But I'm the primary account holder. I've been managing these investments for years, or so you thought," I said quietly. The silence that followed was deafening. I watched as understanding slowly dawned in Stephanie's eyes, followed immediately by a flash of pure rage. "What did you just say?" she whispered. I met her gaze steadily. "I said, or so you thought." Robert looked confused, glancing between us like he was watching a tennis match. "Mom, what are you talking about?" "Robert, sweetheart, who do you think funded those initial investments 7 years ago?" "Dad's inheritance. The $50,000 from his life insurance policy." I shook my head slowly. "Your father's life insurance went to me, remember? Every penny. That $50,000 you think you invested? That was birthday money, Christmas gifts, and savings from your summer jobs. It was gone within 2 years of your marriage." The color drained from his face. "That's impossible. The rental properties, the investment accounts, even the down payment on this house. It all came from me, Robert. From my accounts, my credit, my financial backing. You've been living off my money for 15 years, thinking it was yours." Stephanie shot to her feet so fast her chair toppled backward. "You're lying." "Am I?" I pulled out my phone and opened the email Margaret had sent me that morning. "The Thompson Industries portfolio. Liquidated Tuesday morning, $1.2 million transferred to my personal account. The rental properties on 5th Street, Madison Avenue, and Oak Park. All 3 sold as of yesterday. $847,000 in proceeds. Should I continue?" Robert was staring at me like I'd just spoken in a foreign language. "But the statements, my name is on all the accounts. Your name was on the accounts as a beneficiary and secondary contact. For tax purposes. I was always the primary account holder, the one with actual authority to make decisions." Stephanie's face had gone from pale to flushed to a disturbing shade of purple. "You can't do this. Those are our investments, our properties. We've been counting on that money. Counting on money that was never yours to begin with?" I stood up, suddenly feeling taller than I had in years. "Money that I gave you out of love, expecting nothing in return except basic respect and kindness?" "This is about Thanksgiving," Stephanie snarled. "You're punishing us because we asked for one holiday without your drama." I laughed, and the sound surprised even me. It was genuine, almost joyful. "Stephanie, this isn't punishment. This is clarity. For the first time in 15 years, you're seeing your actual financial situation without my support propping it up." Robert had slumped into his chair, his head in his hands. "Mom, we can't afford this house without the rental income. We can't afford our car payments, Tommy's school, any of it. Then maybe it's time to learn to live within your actual means." "What about Tommy?" Stephanie's voice cracked. "What about his college fund?" "Tommy's education fund is safe. I would never punish a child for his parents' choices. But I'm now the sole trustee, which means I'll decide how and when those funds are used." I gathered my purse and stood to leave. Both of them looked shell-shocked, like survivors of a natural disaster trying to process the destruction around them. "I don't understand," Robert said quietly. Why now? After all these years, why now? I paused at the door, looking back at my son, this man I'd raised and loved and sacrificed everything for, who had sat silently while his wife banished me from his life. Because yesterday you made it clear that I'm not part of this family anymore, so I decided to stop funding it. The last thing I heard as I walked to my car was Stephanie screaming at Robert, her voice shrill with panic and rage. Something about calling lawyers, about fighting this, about how I couldn't just destroy their lives, but I wasn't destroying anything. I was simply stopping my financial support of people who had made it abundantly clear that my presence in their lives was unwelcome. As I drove home, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. Complete and total peace with my decisions. They'd wanted me gone. Now they were about to learn exactly what my absence really cost. The next 2 weeks were a symphony of desperation that I observed from the comfortable distance of my newfound independence. The first call came at 6 a.m, 3 days after our confrontation. Robert's voice was hoarse, like he'd been crying or shouting or both. Mom, please, we need to talk about this rationally. There has to be a way to work this out. I'd been sipping my coffee and reading the newspaper, actually enjoying the peaceful morning routine I'd never had time for when their crises constantly interrupted my days. What would you like to work out, Robert? The money, the accounts. Mom, we're going to lose everything. You're not losing everything. You're just losing things that were never actually yours. The calls escalated from there. Robert pleading, Stephanie screaming, both of them alternating between threats and bargaining like they were working through the stages of grief at warp speed. I listened to each voicemail with detached interest, marveling at how quickly their facade of financial independence had crumbled. By the end of the first week, they'd put their house on the market. The for sale sign that appeared in their front yard was like a small victory flag planted in the battlefield of their arrogance. I drove by it on my way to my painting class, feeling nothing but satisfaction. The second week brought a new kind of desperation. Stephanie had apparently gotten a job, her first in 15 years, at a local department store. Robert had mentioned it during one of his increasingly frantic phone calls, his voice bitter with humiliation. Stephanie's working retail, Mom. She's folding clothes and dealing with customers who treat her like garbage. Is this what you wanted? I wanted respect, I'd replied calmly. This is just what happens when people have to face reality. But it was Tommy who finally broke through my resolve. Not through manipulation or tears, but through pure innocence. He called me on a Thursday evening, his 8-year-old voice small and confused. Grandma Eleanor? Mommy and Daddy said we have to move to a smaller house. And Mommy cries a lot now. Did I do something wrong? My heart clenched, but not enough to make me regret my decisions. No, sweetheart. You didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes grown-ups have to make changes. Are you still mad at us? Is that why we can't have Thanksgiving together? I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of his confusion. I'm not mad, Tommy. I just learned that sometimes people need to appreciate what they have before they lose it. That night, for the first time since this all began, I questioned whether I'd gone too far. But then I remembered Stephanie's smug smile when she dismissed me from their lives, Robert's silence when I'd needed him to defend me, and I knew I'd made the right choice. The breaking point came 3 weeks after I'd cut off their funding. Robert appeared at my door at 8 o'clock on a Sunday morning, unshaven and wearing the same clothes he'd had on the day before. Behind him stood Stephanie, her perfect composure finally cracked, mascara smudged under her eyes. We need to talk, Robert said, and his voice carried a defeat I'd never heard before. I led them to my living room, noting how Stephanie's eyes darted around like she was cataloging my possessions, probably wondering what else I owned that she'd counted on inheriting. The house sold, Robert said without preamble. We're moving into an apartment next week. Tommy has to change schools because we can't afford the private tuition anymore. I nodded, but said nothing. Stephanie lost her job yesterday. She couldn't handle the hours, the physical demands. She's never had to work like that before. And? Stephanie finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. We're sorry. I studied her face, looking for sincerity beneath the desperation. Sorry for what exactly? For taking you for granted, Robert said quickly. For not appreciating everything you've done for us over the years. For treating you badly. Stephanie added, though the words seemed to stick in her throat. I leaned back in my chair, feeling oddly calm, and they exchanged glances, clearly confused. And what? Robert asked. I'm waiting for you to apologize for dismissing me from your lives, for telling me I wasn't welcome at family gatherings, for making me feel like an unwanted burden in my own son's life. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Finally, Stephanie spoke. Eleanor, I was wrong to say you couldn't come to Thanksgiving. I was stressed, overwhelmed with party planning, and I took it out on you unfairly. It was the closest thing to a real apology I'd ever gotten from her, but it still felt hollow, motivated by desperation rather than genuine remorse. What do you want from me? I asked. We want you to come back, Robert said. We want to be a family again. On whose terms? Yours, Stephanie said quickly. Whatever you want, whatever conditions you need to set, we'll agree to them. I looked at my son, this man who had let his wife control every aspect of our relationship for 26 years, and I saw something I'd never seen before, genuine understanding of what he'd lost. I want weekly dinners, I said. Here, at my house, every Sunday, and I want to spend time with Tommy alone, without you scheduling every minute and monitoring every conversation. They nodded eagerly. I want to be consulted on major decisions that affect Tommy's life. School choices, activities, anything significant. More nodding. And I want acknowledgement. Public acknowledgement that I've been financially supporting this family for 15 years. And gratitude for that support. Stephanie flinched, but nodded. Most importantly, I continued, I want respect. Real respect. Not the fake politeness you've been giving me while you talk behind my back and count my money. Yes, Robert said immediately. Absolutely. I studied their faces for a long moment, seeing desperation, but also something that might have been genuine remorse. All right, I said finally. I'll consider restoring some of the financial support. Not all of it, and not immediately. You'll need to prove that you've learned something from this experience. The relief that flooded their faces was almost comical. But understand this, I added, my voice turning steel hard. This is your one and only chance. If you ever treat me with disrespect again, if you ever take my generosity for granted, if you ever make me feel unwelcome in my own family, there won't be another conversation. There won't be any money, any inheritance, any support of any kind. Are we clear? They nodded so vigorously I thought their heads might fall off. As they left, making plans for Sunday dinner and promising to call with updates about their apartment search, I felt something settle in my chest. Not victory exactly, but equilibrium, balance. For the first time in decades, I was entering a relationship with my family as an equal partner rather than a silent benefactor. And if they forgot that lesson, well, I'd proven I was perfectly capable of living without them.